On a crisp morning in 1925, a Japanese naval officer stepped onto the factory floor of Ford Motor Company's River Rouge complex in Dearborn, Michigan, and witnessed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Captain Isoroku Yamamoto, a rising star in the Imperial Japanese Navy, watched in stunned silence as automobiles rolled off assembly lines with mechanical precision, one vehicle emerging every 10 seconds. The roar of machinery filled the cavernous space, drowning out conversation, while thousands of workers moved in choreographed harmony. What Yamamoto saw that day would fundamentally alter his understanding of American industrial might and eventually shape his dire predictions about any future conflict between Japan and the United States. The year 1925 found Japan at a crossroads. The nation had emerged from World War I as a recognized world power, having sided with the Allies and expanded its influence across the Pacific. Yet beneath this veneer of strength lay troubling realities. Japan's industrial capacity remained dwarfed by Western powers, its natural resources limited, and its economy dependent on imports. The Naval Ministry, recognizing these vulnerabilities, had dispatched Yamamoto to America as a naval attaché in Washington, tasking him with studying American military capabilities and industrial potential. What began as a routine intelligence assignment would become a transformative experience. Yamamoto arrived in San Francisco in April of 1925, already carrying impressive credentials. Born Isoroku Takano in 1884 in Nagaoka, a castle town in Niigata Prefecture, he had been adopted into the Yamamoto family and taken their name, as was customary for sons of samurai families seeking to preserve their lineage. He had graduated from the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1904, seventh in his class of 300 students. During the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, he had served aboard the cruiser Nishin during the Battle of Tsushima, where a Russian shell explosion cost him 2 fingers on his left hand and left him with permanent scars. The Japanese victory in that conflict had announced Japan's arrival as a naval power, but Yamamoto understood that defeating a declining Tsarist Russia differed vastly from confronting an industrial colossus like America. His orders were straightforward but ambitious: observe, learn, and report on American military preparedness and industrial capacity. The Navy wanted detailed assessments of shipbuilding capabilities, aviation developments, and manufacturing techniques. What they received would be far more sobering than anyone anticipated. Yamamoto threw himself into the assignment with characteristic thoroughness, traveling extensively throughout the United States over the next 3 years. He visited naval installations from Norfolk to San Diego, toured aircraft factories in California, inspected steel mills in Pittsburgh, and studied oil refineries in Texas. But nothing prepared him for Detroit. The Motor City in the 1920s represented the pinnacle of American industrial achievement. Henry Ford's revolutionary assembly line had transformed manufacturing, and the automotive industry had become the engine of American prosperity. Detroit's factories employed hundreds of thousands of workers, consumed vast quantities of steel, rubber, and glass, and produced millions of vehicles annually. Yamamoto toured multiple facilities during his stay, including Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler plants. According to records maintained by the Naval Historical Center, his detailed reports back to Tokyo described production capabilities that seemed almost fantastical to Japanese military planners. The scale of Detroit's industrial complex defied comprehension for someone from a nation where manufacturing remained largely small-scale and labor-intensive. At the River Rouge complex alone, Ford employed over 75,000 workers in 1927. The facility sprawled across 2,000 acres, containing its own steel mill, glass factory, power plant, and assembly lines. Raw materials entered one end of the complex, and finished automobiles emerged from the other. Yamamoto watched iron ore arrive by ship, witnessed it transformed into steel within hours, and saw that steel shaped into automobile bodies before the day ended. The vertical integration and efficiency stunned him. Walking through the factory floors, Yamamoto took meticulous notes. He observed how Ford had broken down automobile construction into hundreds of simple, repetitive tasks. Workers specialized in single operations, performing them again and again with increasing speed and precision. The moving assembly line brought work to the workers, rather than requiring workers to move to the work, eliminating wasted motion and time. Yamamoto calculated production rates, measured the flow of materials, and interviewed managers about capacity expansion plans. His engineering background from the Naval Academy allowed him to grasp the technical sophistication involved. These were not merely factories, they were precision instruments of mass production. But Yamamoto's observations extended beyond manufacturing techniques. He recognized that Detroit's automotive industry represented something more fundamental about American society and economy. The United States had created a mass market for consumer goods, with millions of ordinary citizens purchasing automobiles, refrigerators, and other manufactured products. This consumer demand drove industrial expansion, which in turn created employment and wealth, which further increased demand. Japan had nothing comparable. Its population remained largely rural and poor, its domestic market limited, and its manufacturing focused on export goods and military production. The circular engine of American capitalism operated on a scale Japan could not replicate. During his travels, Yamamoto also studied American oil production and distribution. He visited fields in Oklahoma and Texas, where drilling technology had advanced dramatically since the early days of petroleum extraction. He toured refineries that processed crude oil into gasoline, kerosene, and other petroleum products with remarkable efficiency. He observed the extensive pipeline and distribution networks that delivered fuel throughout the continent. The implications were unmistakable. America's domestic oil production dwarfed Japan's virtually non-existent petroleum reserves. Any extended conflict would see Japan rapidly depleted of fuel for its ships, aircraft, and vehicles, while America's reserves seemed inexhaustible. The American aviation industry also captured Yamamoto's attention. He had developed a passionate interest in naval aviation, recognizing that aircraft carriers and naval air power would dominate future warfare. In California, he visited aircraft manufacturers and observed rapid advances in engine technology, airframe design, and production methods. American companies were applying mass production techniques to aircraft manufacturing, suggesting that in wartime, the United States could produce military aircraft in quantities that would overwhelm any opponent. Japan's aircraft industry, by contrast, remained dependent on skilled craftsmen building planes essentially by hand, limiting production capacity. Steel production provided another sobering comparison. Pittsburgh's mills produced more steel in a single year than Japan's entire output. Yamamoto toured facilities where blast furnaces, open hearth furnaces, and rolling mills operated continuously, transforming iron ore into the steel that formed the backbone of modern warfare. Ships, tanks, artillery, and countless other military necessities required vast quantities of steel. The United States Steel Corporation alone possessed production capacity exceeding Japan's total national output. In any prolonged conflict, this disparity would prove decisive. Throughout his assignment, Yamamoto compiled detailed statistical analyses. He calculated that American industrial capacity exceeded Japan's by a factor of at least 10 to 1 in most categories, and by even larger margins in critical areas like steel, oil, and automotive production. His reports included production figures, facility locations, transportation networks, and estimates of how quickly American industry could convert from civilian to military production. He provided his superiors with the most comprehensive assessment of American industrial might that Japanese intelligence had ever possessed. Yamamoto's time in America extended beyond factory visits and statistical analysis. He immersed himself in American culture, studying the society that had produced such industrial dynamism. He attended university lectures at Harvard, where he engaged with American students and professors discussing philosophy, politics, and international relations. He traveled to New York City, experiencing the energy and diversity of America's largest metropolis. He visited Washington repeatedly, observing Congress in session and studying American political institutions. He even took up card games, becoming a skilled poker player who appreciated the game's blend of probability, psychology, and risk management. These cultural observations reinforced his understanding of fundamental differences between American and Japanese societies. America's culture celebrated individualism, entrepreneurship, and innovation. Its democratic political system, despite its flaws, created space for debate and dissent. Its educational system emphasized practical skills and critical thinking. Its economy rewarded risk-taking and efficiency. Its society, though certainly not free from prejudice and inequality, nonetheless absorbed immigrants from around the world and channeled their energies toward productive ends. Japan, by contrast, remained hierarchical, tradition-bound, and suspicious of foreign influences. Its education system emphasized rote learning and obedience. Its economy served state interests more than individual initiative. Yamamoto returned to Japan in 1928, carrying knowledge that weighed heavily upon him. He had witnessed American power firsthand, not through abstract statistics, but through direct observation of the factories, fields, and facilities that generated that power. He understood that any war between Japan and the United States would pit Japanese determination and martial spirit against American industrial capacity and resources. History had shown that while spirit and skill mattered in warfare, sustained conflicts ultimately favored nations that could outproduce their enemies. The American Civil War, World War I, and countless other conflicts demonstrated that industrial capacity determined outcomes when opponents possessed comparable military skill. Back in Tokyo, Yamamoto submitted his reports to the Naval Ministry. The documents painted a stark picture of relative national strength. He emphasized that Japan could not match American production in any meaningful category. He warned that converting American automotive factories to military production would enable the United States to build tanks, aircraft, and military vehicles in unprecedented quantities. He noted that American shipyards, though operating below capacity during peacetime, could expand rapidly to construct warships far faster than Japan's shipyards. He stressed that America's oil reserves gave it an insurmountable advantage in any conflict dependent on mechanized warfare. His superiors received these reports with mixed reactions. Some naval officers appreciated Yamamoto's thorough analysis and shared his concerns about Japanese limitations. Others dismissed his warnings as excessive pessimism or even defeatism. The Imperial Japanese Army, in particular, remained confident that Japanese fighting spirit and tactical superiority would overcome any material disadvantages. Army officers who had never visited America found it difficult to accept that the nation they viewed as soft and pleasure-seeking could pose a serious military threat. Cultural biases and institutional rivalries complicated rational assessment of Japanese strategic position. Through the early 1930s, Yamamoto continued to rise through naval ranks while advocating for realistic strategic planning. He became an outspoken proponent of naval aviation, pushing for aircraft carrier development and training programs for naval pilots. He understood that Japan's best chance in any conflict with the United States lay in achieving quick, decisive victories before American industrial mobilization could take effect. Carrier-based aircraft offered mobility and striking power that could potentially neutralize American advantages in early stages of war. But Yamamoto harbored no illusions about long-term prospects. As tensions between Japan and Western powers increased throughout the 1930s, driven by Japanese expansion in China and competing interests in the Pacific, Yamamoto found himself in an increasingly difficult position. He opposed Japan's alignment with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, viewing these alliances as strategically unsound. He argued against antagonizing the United States through aggressive expansion. He privately warned colleagues that war with America would be catastrophic for Japan. Yet as a serving officer, he remained bound by duty to follow orders from his superiors and ultimately from the emperor himself. In 1936, Yamamoto became Vice Minister of the Navy, giving him greater influence over policy. He used this position to advocate for realistic assessments of Japanese strategic options. He argued that Japan should avoid war with America at almost any cost, understanding that such a conflict would likely end in Japanese defeat. During a meeting with senior naval officers in 1940, as tensions with the United States intensified over Japan's occupation of French Indochina and its continued war in China, Yamamoto made his most famous and prophetic statement. According to multiple accounts from officers present, including memoirs published after the war, he declared that if ordered to fight America, he could promise to run wild for 6 months to a year, but could guarantee nothing thereafter. Some versions of this conversation include Yamamoto, stating explicitly that Japan would ultimately lose any extended conflict with the United States. This assessment, born from his experiences in Detroit and throughout America in the 1920s, represented his honest evaluation of Japanese prospects. The 6-month prediction reflected careful calculation rather than arbitrary pessimism. Yamamoto understood that Japan could achieve initial successes through surprise attacks and superior naval aviation, areas where Japanese forces had trained extensively. He knew that American forces in the Pacific remained relatively weak in 1940 and 1941, with much of the American fleet concentrated at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, and American military attention focused on events in Europe where war already raged. A coordinated Japanese offensive could neutralize American naval power in the Pacific and seize resource-rich territories in Southeast Asia before American forces could respond effectively. But Yamamoto also understood what would follow. American industry would shift to military production, applying the same mass manufacturing techniques he had observed in Detroit to building warships, aircraft, tanks, and weapons in quantities Japan could never match. American oil production would fuel operations across the vast Pacific, while Japan would struggle to protect supply lines from newly conquered territories. American military personnel would gain combat experience, closing the initial skill gap. American resources would enable sustained operations while Japanese forces gradually weakened. The timeline he proposed reflected his judgment of how long Japan could maintain advantages before American mobilization overwhelmed Japanese forces. His warnings went largely unheeded by military leaders committed to expansionist policies. The Imperial Japanese Army, which held significant political power, pushed for continued expansion in China and Southeast Asia to secure resources and establish a defensive perimeter. Army officers argued that Western powers, preoccupied with war in Europe, would not risk conflict over Japanese expansion in Asia. Many genuinely believed that American society, soft and individualistic, lacked the will to fight a determined opponent. These officers had not visited Detroit or witnessed American industrial capacity firsthand. They based their assessments on wishful thinking and cultural prejudice rather than objective analysis. Prime Minister Fumimaro Konoe and others in civilian government attempted to negotiate with the United States through 1940 and 1941, seeking to avoid war while preserving Japanese gains in China. American demands for Japanese withdrawal from China and Indochina, backed by increasingly severe economic sanctions including oil embargoes, created what Japanese leaders viewed as an impossible choice. Withdrawal meant abandoning years of military effort and accepting diminished status. Continuing expansion risked war with America. Caught between unacceptable alternatives, Japanese decision-makers drifted toward conflict. In October of 1941, General Hideki Tojo became prime minister, replacing Konoe. Tojo, an army officer committed to expansion, believed that Japan must break out of the encirclement imposed by American, British, and Dutch embargoes. With Japan's oil reserves declining and military preparations complete, the window for action was closing. The decision for war moved from possibility to probability to inevitability. Yamamoto, now commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, Japan's most senior naval position, received orders to prepare for war with the United States. Despite his personal opposition to war with America, Yamamoto fulfilled his duty with characteristic professionalism. If Japan must fight, he would employ every tactical and strategic advantage to give his nation the best possible chance. He developed the plan for the attack on Pearl Harbor, designed to destroy American battleship strength in the Pacific and provide Japan with the 6-month window he had predicted. The operation required carriers to approach Hawaii undetected, launch aircraft in coordination, achieve complete surprise, and inflict maximum damage before American forces could respond. Success demanded meticulous planning, rigorous training, and favorable circumstances. Through November of 1941, Japanese carriers trained intensively for the operation. Pilots practiced torpedo attacks in shallow water, developed armor-piercing bomb techniques, and rehearsed coordination between different aircraft types. The Japanese strike force departed from Hitokapu Bay and the Kuril Islands on November 26, 1941, maintaining strict radio silence as it steamed across the North Pacific toward Hawaii. 6 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, accompanied by battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and support vessels, constituted the most powerful naval task force Japan had ever assembled. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo commanded the operation, carrying Yamamoto's detailed plans and the weight of Japan's desperate gamble. Weather conditions favored the approach, with clouds and rough seas providing concealment from American reconnaissance. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Japanese aircraft launched from carriers positioned north of Oahu. 183 aircraft comprised the first wave, including torpedo bombers, dive bombers, horizontal bombers, and fighters. They struck Pearl Harbor at 7:55 in the morning Hawaiian time, achieving complete surprise. American battleships, moored along Battleship Row, presented perfect targets for Japanese torpedoes and bombs. Within 2 hours, the attack had sunk or severely damaged 8 battleships, destroyed 188 aircraft, damaged additional vessels and facilities, and killed 2,400 American military personnel and civilians. By tactical measures, the attack succeeded brilliantly. Japanese forces had neutralized American battleship strength in the Pacific, while suffering minimal losses of 55 airmen and 9 aircraft. Yamamoto's prediction of running wild for 6 months seemed vindicated as Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in the following months. Hong Kong fell on December 25. Manila fell on January 2, 1942. Singapore, Britain's supposedly impregnable fortress, surrendered on February 15 with 80,000 British Commonwealth troops captured. The Dutch East Indies collapsed by March, delivering to Japan the oil resources that had motivated much of its expansion. Burma fell, threatening India. Japanese forces reached the shores of New Guinea, menacing Australia. Yet even in these victories, elements of Yamamoto's grim prediction began manifesting. The Pearl Harbor attack, while tactically successful, had failed to destroy American aircraft carriers, which happened to be at sea during the attack. Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga survived to form the core of American naval resistance. The attack had also missed fuel storage facilities and repair facilities at Pearl Harbor, oversights that would aid American recovery. Most significantly, the attack had unified American public opinion behind war with Japan. Prior to Pearl Harbor, America remained divided over involvement in foreign conflicts. After the surprise attack, national unity and determination to defeat Japan became overwhelming. American industrial mobilization began immediately. President Franklin Roosevelt called for production targets that seemed impossible: 60,000 aircraft in 1942, 125,000 in 1943. The factories Yamamoto had visited in Detroit converted from civilian to military production. Ford's Willow Run plant, built in 1942, eventually produced one B-24 Liberator bomber every hour. General Motors produced aircraft engines, tanks, trucks, and weapons. Chrysler built tanks. Across America, similar conversions occurred. Shipyards that had built 1 or 2 vessels per year began launching ships weekly. The Detroit industrial complex Yamamoto had observed now directed its full capacity toward military production. The timeline Yamamoto had predicted proved remarkably accurate. 6 months after Pearl Harbor, in June of 1942, American and Japanese carrier forces clashed at the Battle of Midway. American codebreakers had deciphered Japanese communications, providing Admiral Chester Nimitz with advance warning of Japanese plans to seize Midway Atoll. American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, engaged Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. In a battle decided by minutes and miles, American dive bombers caught Japanese carriers with aircraft being refueled and rearmed on their decks. All 4 Japanese carriers sank, taking with them hundreds of irreplaceable veteran pilots and aircraft. Japan lost offensive capability in the Pacific, exactly as Yamamoto had predicted.
The experience of Yamamoto visiting Detroit and later warning about war with America illuminated broader patterns in international relations and military history. Nations frequently underestimate opponents, overestimate their own capabilities, and allow ideological commitments to override rational analysis. Japanese leaders in the 1930s and 40s were not uniquely foolish or irrational. They faced genuine strategic dilemmas, operated under significant constraints, and made decisions that seemed reasonable given their assumptions and information. Their mistake lay in dismissing warnings from those like Yamamoto, who had directly observed American power. The role of industrial capacity in modern warfare, central to Yamamoto's warnings, has remained relevant through subsequent conflicts. World War II demonstrated conclusively that industrial production determines outcomes in sustained conflicts between similarly capable opponents. The Cold War competition between the United States and Soviet Union revolved substantially around industrial and economic capacity. Contemporary military analysis continues to emphasize production capabilities, supply chains, and economic foundations of military power. Yamamoto's observations in Detroit captured fundamental truths about modern warfare. The story also illustrated limitations of intelligence and analysis in shaping policy. Yamamoto provided Japanese leaders with accurate information about American industrial capacity. His reports contained detailed statistics, facility descriptions, and capability assessments. He warned explicitly about consequences of war with America. Yet this intelligence failed to prevent decisions that led to catastrophic defeat. Information alone cannot determine policy when political, ideological, and institutional factors push in different directions. Decision-makers often seek intelligence that confirms preferred policies rather than information that challenges assumptions. The cultural dimensions of Yamamoto's story highlighted how societies perceive and misperceive each other. Japanese military leaders who dismissed American fighting spirit as inferior to Japanese martial culture made fundamental attribution errors. They mistook American cultural emphasis on individual freedom and material comfort for weakness, failing to recognize that democratic societies can mobilize effectively when threatened. Americans made reciprocal mistakes, often underestimating Japanese fighting spirit, tactical skill, and technological capabilities. Mutual misperceptions complicated diplomacy and contributed to conflict. The transformation of post-war Japanese-American relations demonstrated that former enemies can become allies when circumstances change. The nations that fought with such bitterness from 1941 to 1945 developed close political, economic, and security partnerships in subsequent decades. American military bases in Japan support security arrangements beneficial to both nations. Economic integration creates mutual prosperity. Cultural exchange fosters understanding. The relationship, though not without tensions, shows that historical enmity need not be permanent. Yamamoto's legacy in Japan remains complex. He is remembered as a skilled naval officer who achieved early victories, a strategic thinker who understood Japan's limitations, and a tragic figure who could not prevent disaster. Monuments and museums commemorate his service. Historical studies analyze his decisions and impact. Popular culture portrays him variously as hero, victim, or cautionary figure. The multiplicity of interpretations reflects ongoing Japanese efforts to understand their wartime history and its meanings. In America, Yamamoto is remembered primarily as the architect of Pearl Harbor, the enemy admiral whose tactical brilliance nearly succeeded in crippling American Pacific forces. His warnings about industrial capacity receive less attention in American historical memory than his role in planning the surprise attack. The interception and shooting down of his aircraft in 1943 is recalled as an intelligence triumph and tactical success. American understanding of Yamamoto focuses on his role as enemy rather than his attempts to prevent war. The factories Yamamoto visited in Detroit underwent their own transformations. The River Rouge complex continued operating for decades, though with reduced employment as automation increased efficiency. American automobile industry dominance gradually eroded as foreign competition, including from Japan, offered superior products. The passage of 8 decades since Yamamoto's visit to Detroit and the subsequent Pacific War offers perspective on lessons learned and unlearned. International relations remain characterized by competition, miscalculation, and occasional conflict. Nations continue to underestimate opponents, overestimate their own capabilities, and allow ideological commitments to override prudent analysis. The fundamental dynamics that led Japan into catastrophic war with America remain relevant to contemporary strategic challenges. Modern military planners study the Pacific War as a case study in industrial mobilization, logistics, carrier warfare, and amphibious operations. Professional military education includes examination of Japanese strategic failures and American strategic successes. Yamamoto's warnings about industrial capacity inform contemporary understanding of military-economic relationships. His successful prediction of the 6-month window demonstrates value of realistic assessment over wishful thinking. Military professionals learn from both his strategic insight and his inability to prevent disaster. The economic dimensions of the story continue to resonate. Global economic integration has created interdependencies that make major power conflict more costly than in Yamamoto's era. China's economic rise presents challenges different from but related to those Japan faced in the early 20th century. How rising powers integrate into existing international systems, whether through cooperation or conflict, remains central to international stability. Yamamoto's observation of American industrial capacity and his warnings about challenging such power offer historical perspective on contemporary strategic competition. The technological revolution since World War II has transformed warfare while maintaining relevance of industrial capacity. Nuclear weapons, precision-guided munitions, cyber warfare, and space-based systems dominate contemporary military planning. Yet underneath technological sophistication lies the same foundation Yamamoto observed: industrial capacity to design, produce, and sustain military systems. Modern advanced weapons require sophisticated manufacturing capabilities, rare materials, skilled labor, and extensive support infrastructure. Nations lacking robust industrial bases cannot field or maintain competitive military forces, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. The role of individuals in shaping history, illustrated by Yamamoto's story, provokes continuing reflection. Could one person have prevented the Pacific War through more effective warnings or different decisions? Historical analysis suggests limited individual agency within broader structural forces. Yamamoto operated within institutional, political, and cultural constraints that limited his influence. Yet individuals do matter at critical junctures. Different leadership might have resulted in different decisions, alternative policies, and possibly avoided outcomes. The tension between structural determination and individual agency remains unresolved in historical interpretation. The story concludes with recognition that Yamamoto's visit to Detroit in the 1920s and his subsequent warnings represent a historical inflection point where knowledge, analysis, and prophecy converged. He saw America's industrial might, understood its implications for warfare, predicted outcomes accurately, and yet could not prevent the conflict he foresaw. His tragedy was that of Cassandra, cursed with accurate prophecy that none would heed. The broader tragedy was that of Japan, which pursued policies leading to predictable disaster, despite warnings from those who knew better. The factories of Detroit that so impressed Yamamoto have largely declined from their mid-20th century peak. Globalization, automation, and deindustrialization transformed American manufacturing. Yet the fundamental lesson Yamamoto learned remains valid. Industrial capacity, resource availability, and economic strength provide foundations for national power. Nations ignore these fundamentals at their peril. Military skill, tactical brilliance, and fighting spirit matter in warfare, but sustained conflicts between comparable opponents are ultimately decided by productive capacity. Today, visitors can tour some of the historic sites Yamamoto visited, including portions of the Ford Rouge factory tour that showcase manufacturing techniques descended from those that amazed Yamamoto in 1925. The tour includes presentations on Ford's history, manufacturing innovations, and contemporary production methods. Walking through these facilities, one can imagine the young Japanese naval captain observing assembly lines, calculating production rates, and recognizing that his nation could never match such industrial might. The experience connects past to present, reminding visitors that strategic decisions have long-term consequences and that accurate assessment of capabilities matters more than wishful thinking. The final assessment of Yamamoto's legacy acknowledges multiple truths simultaneously. He was a skilled naval officer who served his nation with distinction and competence. He was a strategic thinker whose warnings proved accurate but ineffective. He was an architect of aggressive war who nonetheless opposed that war. He was a professional who fulfilled duties he knew would end in failure. He was a man who saw the future clearly but could not change it. These contradictions make him a compelling historical figure whose story continues to generate analysis and debate. The broader historical significance of Yamamoto's Detroit visit and subsequent warnings lies in what the episode reveals about how nations make catastrophic mistakes despite access to accurate information. Japanese leaders possess detailed intelligence about American capabilities through Yamamoto's reports and other sources. They understood, at some level, the risks of war with a power vastly superior in industrial capacity. Yet institutional momentum, ideological commitments, perceived lack of alternatives, and cultural factors combined to produce decisions that led to national disaster. This pattern recurs throughout history, suggesting that human societies struggle to act rationally, even when survival depends on it. The relationship between intelligence gathering and policy formation, central to Yamamoto's story, remains problematic in contemporary governance. Leaders often seek intelligence that confirms preferred policies rather than information that challenges assumptions. Institutional cultures reward conformity and punish dissent. Career incentives discourage bearers of bad news. Cognitive biases lead decision-makers to discount warnings and overestimate capabilities. These dynamics operate across political systems and historical periods, suggesting deeply rooted features of human decision-making, rather than correctable flaws in particular institutions. The question of moral responsibility in warfare, raised by Yamamoto's role, continues to challenge ethical analysis. Professional military officers serve states and follow lawful orders from legitimate authorities. Their technical competence should be applied to executing national policy regardless of personal views. Yet this professional ethic can facilitate atrocities and aggressive wars when state policy violates moral principles. Yamamoto's dilemma exemplifies this tension. A competent officer serving an aggressive regime while personally opposing the policies he implements. Resolving such dilemmas requires frameworks that balance professional duty against moral responsibility. The ultimate irony of Yamamoto's story is that his most significant impact may have been posthumous. His accurate prediction about 6 months of Japanese offensive capability, his warnings about American industrial might, and his role in planning Pearl Harbor all became part of historical memory. These elements contributed to post-war Japanese understanding of their defeat, influenced strategic thinking in subsequent conflicts, and shaped how nations assess relative capabilities. Yamamoto's insights, rejected during his lifetime, eventually gained recognition as prescient analysis of modern warfare's industrial foundations. The transformation of Japan from defeated enemy to American ally and economic competitor represents perhaps the most hopeful dimension of the story. The nation Yamamoto represented, which challenged American power through military means and suffered catastrophic defeat, eventually achieved prosperity and influence through peaceful economic development. This transformation suggests that international competition need not be zero-sum, that former enemies can become partners, and that national success depends more on productive economic activity than military conquest. Yamamoto might have appreciated this outcome, given his understanding of industrial capacity's importance and his opposition to war with America. As the last veterans of World War II pass away and direct memory of the conflict fades, historical interpretation will continue evolving. Future generations will examine Yamamoto's story through frameworks shaped by their own experiences and concerns. They may emphasize different aspects, draw different lessons, and reach different conclusions. This evolution of historical understanding is natural and appropriate. History serves the present by illuminating how societies arrived at their current circumstances, and by offering perspectives on contemporary challenges. The enduring relevance of Yamamoto's visit to Detroit and his subsequent warnings lies in the fundamental questions the episode raises. How do nations assess their capabilities honestly? How can accurate analysis influence policy when institutional and ideological factors push in different directions? What responsibilities do professionals bear for implementing policies they believe will fail? How can societies avoid catastrophic mistakes despite access to information that should prevent such errors? These questions remain as pertinent today as they were in the 1920s and 40s. In the end, Yamamoto's story is one of knowledge and tragedy, foresight and futility, competence and catastrophe. A young naval officer visited American factories in the 1920s and saw clearly what war between Japan and the United States would mean. He calculated the odds, predicted the outcome, and warned his superiors. His warnings were accurate, but ignored. He then fulfilled his duty by planning and executing operations he knew would ultimately fail. He died before witnessing the full scope of the disaster he had foreseen, but his prediction proved tragically accurate. The factories he visited in Detroit, symbols of American industrial might, produced the ships, aircraft, and weapons that overwhelmed Japan exactly as he had warned they would. The historical record preserves Yamamoto's warnings in official reports, personal correspondence, and accounts from officers who heard his predictions. These documents confirm that Japanese leaders possessed accurate information about American capabilities, but chose policies leading to conflict anyway. This failure of intelligence to shape policy, this triumph of ideology over analysis, this preference for comforting myths over uncomfortable truths, these patterns transcend particular historical circumstances and speak to enduring challenges in human decision-making. Yamamoto's story thus serves as both historical account and cautionary tale, reminding us that seeing the future clearly does not guarantee the wisdom to act accordingly, and that nations, like individuals, sometimes rush toward disasters they have been explicitly warned to avoid.